Okay, welcome everybody.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to get to talk to you guys today. This is The Opposite of Silence, a deep dive into a comic about AIDS, the AIDS crisis, and the echoes of empathy. If you want my contact info, I forgot to put it on the slide originally, but Matthew No reminded us earlier today that it's important to have that, so I tried to scroll it in with the program we're using. It's at JD Lunt, JAYDEELUNT, on both Instagram and Twitter. A little bit of my background. I'm a graduate of the Center for Cartoon Studies, and I graduated in the class of 2016. I used to work in mental health about 10 years ago. I worked in it for 2 years, working with emotionally disturbed youth in the community. And I got a very serious case of PTSD from that. After years of therapy and medication, I did what most people do and went off to become a cartoonist in the wilderness of Vermont. While there and afterwards, I worked on When I Returned and A Whole Lifetime of Firsts, which were two collaborations between the Center for Cartoon Studies and the White River Junction VA Hospital. I'm very proud of both of those books, and I've mostly at graphic medicine conferences I've been to. This is my fourth now. I've talked about that work. I was going to do a workshop that I did at the last graphic medicine conference in Brighton for this one, which got everybody together to sit in a room, talk to each other, and draw. But that didn't really translate well to this space and doing something over the computer. So I transitioned into doing a comic, look at one of my comics that deals with the AIDS crisis. And we're going to do a deep dive into looking at a 4-panel comic. It's going to kind of be like a director's commentary that goes on longer than the actual movie. That being said, we're only going to go for about an hour, including the question and answers. This is not going to go the whole 2 hours. That is a relic from when this was going to be a workshop that involved more audience participation. A little bit more about my background is I'm a cis straight guy, and my pronouns are he, him, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the AIDS crisis and particularly what happened to the queer community in San Francisco at that time. I want to underline as many times as possible that I am not an expert on this, and I don't want to come off as an authority on this stuff. I am a creator who was moved by somebody else's work to try to amplify that story in a way that I felt was responsible. And in doing that, hopefully amplify the stories and experiences of others. But that doesn't mean that I feel like I am the voice on this or somebody who should be looked to as an expert on this information. I'm somebody who made a comic, but that being said, I also learned through making this comic how important it is to allow curiosity to create opportunities for empathy. And I've heard the feedback about this comic from other people, and it's been really moving, but also making this comic changed me so as well. So I'm going to walk through the process of how this comic was made, and in the process talk about stuff that is related to the research that I did. It seems strange to imagine that you'd have to do a lot of research for a 4-panel comic, but sometimes that is the case. And then also some of the artistic choices I decided to make in adapting somebody else's work. So we're going to get into all of that. And I'm going to begin by reading this comic. And so here is the psychic weight of scoring fines in San Francisco thrift shops in the late 80s. And I could almost tell which records were yours. They hit the bends all at once. I scored the complete Bach cantatas for $20. I play them over and over again. I thought you'd like to know that someone loves this stuff as much as you did. And I can all but see you on the day you got your death sentence. You sat on the floor and looked out at the rain, a glass of wine in your hand, handle on the stereo. We couldn't make anyone care as the sentimental gentlemen were dropping like flies, but I thought you'd like to know I found your records at the thrift store. Oh, jumping ahead. Sorry. So this comic originally ran in 7 days, which is the alt weekly comic for all of Vermont. It used to be that cities had alt weeklies. Almost every major to minor city had an alt weekly. And Vermont was small enough and is small enough that they could just do it for the whole state. And they have a great program where they offer a space to CCS students at a first come, first served basis. And this was a comic I'd been thinking about for a long time. Actually, and we'll get into it, but I'd thought about making this as a comic for about 3 years before I ever got around to putting this comic together. And it originally ran in 7 days. And I was really excited about that. The color tone and color choices of the comic really reflect my love of the printed page on newspaper in particular. I really wanted, once it was translated to digital, to have it still have both that bright and muted tone that a lot of newspaper comics have, because they use very bright colors on very cheap paper, so it comes across as muted. So that was a real goal in making this comic. And I still have a handful of prints I made of this comic that are designed to fit in LP frames, like record frames. If anyone's interested, they could hit me up after this. I could probably mail them at some point. We're under shelter in place right now here in Rhode Island. That just started today, but when that's lifted, I'd be happy to talk to people about that. But first, before I get into any more of the comic, I think it's important to know a little bit about my background. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was born in the mid-'70s, and so I grew up right near the epicenter of the AIDS crisis. And I also grew up in the evangelical church. And because of that, what I first learned about the queer community, about what was happening with the AIDS crisis, stuff like that, was really, really heinous, very, very bad things. In fact, the first comic I was ever exposed to that dealt with AIDS would have been a chick tract. Those little freebie zines you would find by this one publisher that just has crazy, judgmental, evil church talk about just horribly judgmental, monstrous comics. In fact, I want to, trigger warning, share a panel from that just so that you can get a sense of the kind of comics I was exposed to when this crisis was first beginning. So it says, one character is saying, if Jesus hadn't saved me and cast out the devil and its nasty thoughts, I could have become a lesbian or worse and dying from AIDS just like you are now. Wait a minute. We were born this way, Clara. That's a big fat lie to justify your lifestyle. Out of the last 40 patients, almost every one of them was sexually molested as a child. What about you, gentlemen? And so that is the worldview I grew up in. And oddly, it was also comics that started to pull me out of that worldview. My next exposure about the AIDS crisis came from a comics anthology called Stripped AIDS USA. Here is the cover. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get some scans. I just had to pull what I could off of the internet because my copy of this is somewhere in a filing cabinet at my parents' home in California with most of the rest of my comics I grew up on. I had bought this anthology because I was a big fan of Bill Sienkiewicz, who did the cover to this work. I knew him mostly from his comics like New Mutants and Electra Assassin. It was kind of weird because, these were like fairly mainstream superhero-y type comics. And that's what I knew. I was 13 years old when I bought this, and it exposed me to all sorts of underground artists, and it exposed me to a whole different world of storytelling and stuff that I never would have come about if my parents had paid more attention to the comics I was buying when I was a kid. And if I hadn't somehow decided to follow creators more than characters when it came to dealing with comics. It was also my first exposure to queer narratives and hearing voices other than the voices I heard in church talk about the experience of AIDS. It was a very pivotal book for me. I could only find one scan from the actual book, and here it is. This is, I'll just let you guys take it in for a second with the monkeys and AIDS and just sit with it. This comic was created by Pat Redding. She was a Marvel assistant editor at the time, and she worked on G.I. Joe and Conan comics mostly. And this might not have been the page I would have chosen if I was going to be talking about some of the more sophisticated comic storytelling that went on in that anthology. But it is a very emotionally raw page. And to give a context to what her work normally looked like, she inked this copy or this issue of The Amazing Spider-Man. She did a lot of fill-in inking work at the time. So in an odd way, this brought the reality of the AIDS crisis to me in a way that some of the more sophisticated cartoonists whose work I didn't know at the time might not have, because this thing that I was hearing was this horrible thing that only happened to a certain section of people who were very, very bad. Suddenly, the editor of G.I. Joe, who I liked, the person who was helping Todd McFarlane make kick-ass Amazing Spider-Man comics, was sharing how she was deeply affected by what was going on. So this whole comic made a big impact on me, including some of the lesser-known work. Eventually, I left the evangelical church, and I was very involved at a writers and artists retreat in Sonoma County that had a big impact on my creative life. It was there that I discovered I wanted to be a cartoonist and stuff like that. But as far as making this comic's concerned, one of the real important connections I made while I was attending this retreat twice a year for about a decade was a musician and writer named Grenold Coffey. He goes by Gren Coffey. And he's a very talented guy. I absolutely adore him and his stuff, and I will be plugging a lot of it in this talk. But when I first got to know him, he was writing stories about growing up as a punk in the Bay Area during the AIDS crisis, and some of the stuff that some of the people that he did drugs with or stuff like that, like what happened with that. He would fictionalize that stuff and tell these stories. And I was really drawn to that. And then somewhere along the way, just as I was transitioning out of writing prose into making comics, he started transitioning more into making music. And he played a song at one of the writers and artists retreats about 2 years before I even thought about going to CCS, called Your Records at the Thrift Store. And it's on a release by his band Pelicanopolis. You can find it on Bandcamp. It's a great little 4-song EP anyway, but it has the song that this comic is based on. And I was really moved by that work. And as soon as I started making comics, which was around late 2013 to 2014, I thought about how much I wanted to adapt this song into comics. But adaptation is a tricky thing, and I'd like to read the lyrics to you so I can kind of let you have those in your head while I talk about the choices I made as a creator in shaping something like a song into a comic. I would normally play the song, but I don't trust my technological capabilities to be able to do that effectively. So instead, I'm going to read you most of the lyrics from Gren's song, Your Records at the Thrift Store. I saw your records at the thrift store, the complete Bach cantatas. What a score! It all showed up at once in the bin, and I was lucky enough to be there with $20 to spend. Thumbing through your records at the thrift store, I could somehow tell which ones were yours. I play them over and over again. I thought you'd like to know that someone loves this stuff as much as you did. And they don't make queens like you anymore with your cardigans and cologne. Those cookie cutter kids would never know how to do it on your own. I saw your records at the thrift store. You guys were dropping like flies and our eyes were sore. It wasn't right or fair, and we couldn't get anyone to care when the sentimental gentlemen were no more. And they don't make queens like you anymore with your cardigans and cologne. Those cookie cutter kids would never know how to do it on their own. And they don't make queens like you anymore. No two of you were the same. I can see you drinking red wine on your floor, playing Handel while it rains on the day your death sentence came. And they don't make queens like you anymore. It's much, much better with music than what I just read you. But I thought it was important just to give you a sense of what I was adapting. And a few quick things about adaptation is when I first started thinking about adapting this into a comic, I thought about adapting all of the lyrics and making like an 8-page comic about this. But the nature of songwriting is that all the information that you need to convey an experience is there in the text. So any drawing that goes on is just going to be illustration, which can be fine. But if you're thinking in terms of comics, you always want the pictures to be doing something that the text can't do. Because if the text can do it, you don't need the pictures. So over time, I realized that using all of this song as a comic would be redundant and also would be a weak way of communicating this thing that I found incredibly moving. The other thing was I had to take the rhymes out of the text. I wanted to use as much of Gren's words as possible, but at the same time, to have it rhyme would give a comic which sits still on a page a sing-songy quality, quite literally, that would go against the seriousness of the topic in a way that isn't the same in a song where you expect something to hold that shape. You have the structure and rhythm of comics to do work that rhyming would normally do in a song. So I had to kind of untangle the language of the comic. And one last thing that I think is really important to talk about is I got Gren's permission to adapt this comic, but his song is about his experience. And in adapting that, I felt like there was aspects of it that I was allowed to engage in, such as the actual story of somebody finding records in a record store and thinking about, oh my God, all these records came from this one person and I know how they got here, versus somebody who's lived through that, seeing what the queer experience is like now and mourning the more solitary experience of the people who died earlier in the AIDS crisis, to adapt something like, and they don't make queens like you anymore with your cardigans and cologne. Those cookie cutter kids would never know how to do it on your own. To adapt that into the comic would be adding a level of judgment that is not immediate to the story, and it's also not my experience or judgment to make. So I felt it was very important to strip away some elements of the song that I don't want to judge the songwriter for, of course, because he's talking about his experience. But as a creator, that wasn't part of what I felt was responsible or could be part of what I could tell. So let's dive into the comic itself and go a little deep. Here's the whole comic as it ran. Originally, again, there's a shout out for Pelicanopolis. I think it's important before I go panel to panel just to see how the original comic sat on the page, and you can start to see some relationships between the images. 3 of the 4 panels are very much defined by rectangular framing, and the rectangles work to frame the most important elements of the story. And then there's a third one that is very round that acts as a grace note and a moment of balance to the rest of the comic. We'll begin with this panel. Now, I'm a real music geek, as anybody who's unfortunate enough to bring up Thelonious Monk around me knows. I will talk your ear off about the music that I love. And flipping through CDs and record bins and stuff is something I'm well acquainted with and is something that gives me a real visceral sense. So I wanted to open the comic with that and just give a sense of what it feels like to be flipping through the stacks, and especially when such a mundane but enjoyable experience can suddenly take on weight, like in the context of this story, where all of a sudden you have someone who is doing this thing kind of half paying attention to what they're doing and noticing, oh my gosh, there's a lot of Baroque records in here. Oh, that probably comes from the same collection. Oh, why am I seeing collections like this showing up in the thrift stores these days? The whole weight of that. So I wanted to give that whole experience. When you're telling a comic, again, you don't want to be too literal. So I didn't want the flipping through of the records to show the Bach cantatas, because that would just make this illustration. I needed to have a record that was Baroque music, and then I have an opportunity to tell more of a story with that. So I'm not a real expert on Baroque music, but Google's your friend. I wanted something that had a very graphic album cover that had a face. I figured since most classical Baroque music, etc., had to do with religious stuff, there had to be a good example of a martyr who had classical work done about them. I didn't want to use Jesus because that would be way too heavy-handed and obvious. But I started doing research, and I came across Scarlatti's St. Cecilia Mass, and that seemed like a really good fit. I wanted to use a real record label. When I did research of that, I found 2 versions of it, and there was one where we're going to see in a second, where the placement of the figure and the building that is all dark behind the figure was one way, and then there was one where it was more open in clouds. I chose to use that one for the comic instead of the more ominous, dark-looking cover. But for some reason, I couldn't find that version, the one I actually used on the internet when I was researching for this talk. So this is the one I was able to find, and it is a farther drawn back version of the same picture, but also some of it has been given a dark background so they could list all the musicians who were involved in it. So this is a later version of the cover, but it was basically the same idea. Either way, you have that face inviting both the reader and the person flipping through the records into a new relationship. And this comic is all about relationships. So being able to use the invitation of an open face to help the reader mirror their experience that the record buyer is having in being pulled into the story of someone that they've never met, but they know through these records, just seemed like a really great choice. Plus, I just love the Argo label, so I wanted to get that in there. To add more context to this, here's another picture of Saint Cecilia. She's the patron saint of musicians, which wasn't initially what I'd known about her when I was putting this together, but as I was researching, that just gave another level of meaning and significance to this first panel. I don't expect the general reader to know this, and it's never important, but when you're working with as concise a medium as comics, especially if you're talking about a 4-panel comic, I think it's really important to be able to pull as much information as possible into the panel and tell the reader as much as you can. You have this wonderful, weighty symbolic language, and if you can add more and more weight to it by the way you frame your storytelling and the language that you're using, then you might as well use that. So having a martyr, having someone who's celebrating music be the first thing you see in this comic just echoes absolutely everything else that's going on in this story. In contrast, you have this very simple panel where there's not a lot of information going on. There's not a lot of embedded information in it, certainly. And this was really a place where I wanted to focus on allowing the experience to be a resting place, a grace note in the whole comic. You've got the narrator listening to these albums that were meaningful to somebody else and now have meaning to them. I wanted to keep the art as stripped back as possible. A little bit about the technical side of this, and this applies to the whole comic, but since there's not a ton to say about this panel otherwise, I think it's worth noting the way that I went about assembling this comic. I do the line work first, the line work and the lettering. I use Photoshop. The next layer will be the color layer. I use flat colors in this comic completely. And then I do a gray wash underneath that to give the illusion of a handmade color comic. But it's really much more simple than that. You just have the color artwork be at about 50% opacity, and then you get a sense of the gray wash behind it, and it makes everything feel very handmade when this is a very not handmade process. And so that's just a little of the technical making of this. The other thing is I wanted to keep things very simple as far as the art was concerned, so I decided not to put any writing with the spinning record, have anything on the label of the record itself. I did want it to be read as a tribute to Columbia Records, because Columbia Records was the only record label I could think of that had both a lot of classical music and my beloved Thelonious Monk. So if I can possibly fit in the most subtle reference to Thelonious Monk in anything, you better believe I would do it. And, like right here, one of his songs, Ugly Beauty, kind of sums up everything about this comic and really my view towards life. But I didn't use all the text and stuff because I had originally added that in, but with the swirling record, it just made too much visual noise to be worthwhile. Now we get to one of the more complex panels. This building on the artwork a little bit. This one I actually used more layers where there would be the panel of the window that's being looked out of, as well as the reflection, the line art for that, then a color layer, and then line art for the buildings behind the reflection with the guy looking across the street, and then the gray wash layer underneath all of that, just to be able to give that sense of perspective. It worked a lot easier than trying to do both layers of the visual on the same layer. There's echoes here as far as like symbolically or anything that's going on. There's echoes here between the first panel and this panel where you have somebody's face being framed by rectangles yet again. But this time it's the character that the narrator has created in his head about this experience. And as such, to have that person be less corporeal, translucent, and almost ghost-like, both in the face of where we're at in the story, with this man hearing that he's gotten the diagnosis of AIDS, and then also in the context of just visually to have that be less solid than the record, which was a concrete thing that the narrator is engaging with, felt like the right artistic choice. In doing research for this panel, I really wanted to capture what San Francisco felt like at that time. So I watched this documentary, We Were Here, the AIDS Years in San Francisco, as well as some other videos on YouTube that covered the AIDS crisis in San Francisco from the time period that this comic takes place. I knew San Francisco pretty well, and I knew the buildings, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But trying to capture the real look and feel of the people who were going through this crisis, and at the same time, having all of this context of experience and story, seeing a documentary like this, looking at old videos, looking at photos, only amplifies the sense of the real lives that were so impacted by this crisis, and finding, so there's the artist eye looking at all of this stuff, trying to find the visual cues to tell the story, but there's also the artist heart that is just being affected by this experience that as it's so easy to David Lewis was talking about this with me before we began this, that we have a very short memory in our experiences, and some of the lessons that really should have been learned in the AIDS crisis might not be learned now. I don't want to make too much of a correlation between the two. There's certainly, with the COVID-19 situation, there is just not the severe stigmatization that people who were dealing with AIDS had to face. So it's a different story, but at the same time, there's so much that we could have learned. After watching this movie and stuff like this, when my friend Gren saw the comic that I made on it, he felt that the character that I drew eerily captured the person that he actually had based the song he wrote on. He was like, he heard I'd seen this movie, and he was like, oh, the guy was in the movie, you must have picked him, and you captured the guy I was talking about in my song. And I was really touched by that, but that's just not true, because I kind of based my illustration on this guy, Bobby Campbell, who was a public health nurse. He was the first person to come out publicly as having AIDS, and he was the self-proclaimed AIDS poster boy, as you can see on his shirt. He co-founded the activist group People with AIDS in 1982. He wrote a column that was syndicated, that was trying to demystify and destigmatize the AIDS crisis. He was also part of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which is one of my favorite organizations you can look up. The British chapter of that actually sainted the wonderful Derek Jarman, filmmaker and author and artist, who is truly one of my favorite creatives. Bobby Campbell's Sister of Perpetual Indulgence name was Sister Florence Nightmare, which is pretty classic for a nurse. Just a big, big fan. And I took him and then added the mustache that I was seeing on almost everybody else in these documentaries. There's a very 1980s mustache that a lot of people had that I felt needed to be in the story. Here's another photo reference. I actually partially used this for the panel that we're looking at. I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about the details, but I did an amalgamation of a couple buildings. The way I tend to use photo reference is I don't like to monkey around with trying to draw something when I can literally trace it. So I will use a light box and do a very loose pencil over something. And then in this case, I ended up using this photo and one other just to get slightly different architecture between the buildings. And then I will go back and ink without looking at the actual photo, so that the drawing can take on more of my hand and less of my eye, and feel of a piece with the rest of the art. In the original penciling that I did, I included the big bushy tree there. But when you placed that on top of the face on top of that, it just became very visually distracting. So I got rid of it and changed the foliage a little bit. Again, this was funny because my friend Gren, felt that he knew the exact city block I had picked to set up this panel. And again, that block didn't exist. I was using buildings and trees from totally different streets all thrown together. One last thing I'd like to note, this is especially important to you cartoonists out there. You will notice how I hardly ever draw necks. I hate drawing necks. A lot of the time when I slouch in front of the mirror, I can't even see my neck. I just kind of like to skip them. And now we're at the last panel. We'll be wrapping up and going to questions soon. We're returning to the triangular or the rectangular framing of the first and third panel. Deciding this last panel visually was the most difficult part of making this comic. When I first tried to draw it, I thought about having a protest scene where you could see the narrator doing that, but all this like crying out about the problem and the just utter lack of concern or support that the gay community had going through the AIDS crisis, at least on a public level, as far as politicians, the government, the media, etc., was concerned. But then in initially sketching that out, that placed way too much emphasis on the narrator. We never need to see the narrator really in this comic. So then the next idea was to have the narrator just maybe see his torso and his waist carrying the records with him as he left the thrift store. But the visuals of that, again, just place too much emphasis on the narrator when the life that's being celebrated and the experience being talked about isn't that of the narrator, but that of the person who had the records. Which then got me thinking, and it would just be too much illustration. If you see the guy carrying the records and you have the text saying, I got the records, then you don't even need the picture. But then I started thinking about one of the major graphic, I'm sorry, I need a little sip of tea here. Much better. Okay. So I started thinking about one of the major graphic images of the AIDS protest era and the iconic silence equals death logo. It felt like such a perfect grace note for a comic which creates a celebration of life to be able to take something like the statement silence equals death in a comic about music, because then all of a sudden the music can start to, the whole comic is about somebody whose life comes back to somebody else when they play music. And so if silence equals death, then music in the context of this comic can mean a life, life, or more importantly, a life and a celebration of that. And so being able to place that image into the comic and really allowed everything that needed to be said to be said. I'm going to talk in a couple minutes about the limits of taking the silence equals death and allowing the comic to flip that. But also, that's something that happens in the comic. A little creative note on this. I originally just took this picture, which I'm going to talk about now, and grabbed it and tried to snag it and throw it in the middle of my comics panel. But because everything was done so cleanly and neatly, it really stood out like a sore thumb, and it was so jarringly out of place. I had to go back and hand trace the silence equals death artwork and hand color it so that it felt of a piece with the rest of the world of the comic. I do want to get into the silence equals death logo and what this kind of thing means. I was struck by one of my favorite Dylan Thomas quotes. I feel like he was probably talking about comics when he said it. He said, "Images are what they say, not what they stand for." And it's so easy to superimpose meaning into things when you can just let things talk for themselves. The silence equals death image in my comic has the resonance that it does as far as allowing its opposite echo to take on meaning only because of the weight of truth that it holds as the icon of the era that it was. It works because it was an image of protest and an image of anger. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that history. This is a photo of 5 of the 6 people who created the silence equals death artwork. From left to right, we have Avram Finkelstein, Charles Kurloff. I should note right now that for the purposes of this talk, all pronunciations are correct. Jorge Socaras, Brian Howard, and Chris Leon. Missing is Oliver Johnston, who passed away due to complications connected with AIDS in 1990. Socaras, in talking about the impetus for creating the silence equals death image, said that when the AIDS crisis was going on and he was watching his lovers and friends dying. He wanted to pound his fists on the ground and wail to heaven. He just felt like he couldn't do anything. But then he felt that that was a choice, but he also had another choice where he could use some of that energy to create something. These men were really inspired by the Guerrilla Girls feminist art collective, specifically in the way that that collective was able to take complex ideas and translate them into street language. And so they set about creating the Silence Equals Death logo. They spent a year talking about things and refining things. They took the pink triangle that was used by the Nazis to brand and mark people as gay, and they flipped it upside down as a way of reclaiming it. They began with silence is deafening, which eventually became silence is death, which eventually became silence equals death with equals spelled out, and then eventually became the equal sign in a short, sharp, incredibly dense and powerful iconographic logo. It was embraced by ACT UP. ACT UP was a very important protest group in the 1980s. It stood for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Here they are in action, protesting on October 11th in 1988 at the FDA headquarters in Rockville, Maryland. And they used the Silence Equals Death sign all the time, and they got permission from the collective who created it to use it. But this was stuff that was in the front line. And this is what Silence Equals Death says, as well as what it came to mean later. And here's our last slide. This is the great artist Keith Haring's remix of the Silence Equals Death ACT UP art. Ignorance equals fear, silence equals death. His bright, incredible, graffiti-ish, child drawing-ish like people doing their thing. I love this remix of the image because it underlines everything I've been talking about. Music, street art, comics, maybe, if we're lucky, even talks at digital conferences, have the power to amplify the voices of people who can get lost in the shuffle. Such work can challenge power structures and inform people about critical issues. And they can help people connect with both their own humanity and the humanity of people whose experiences are well outside their own. Comics transformed my life in this way, as I talked about. Given the world we live in now, I think it's safe to say, or at least could very convincingly be argued, that empathy is the most subversive thing in our culture. You can't get more subversive than being empathetic right now, because so many voices are trying to tell you to focus on yourself and focus on things other than the people who were clearly suffering. The psychic weight of scoring finds at San Francisco thrift shops in the late 1980s was my attempt to amplify the voice of a friend who felt such pain of empathy. And in so doing, it allowed me to connect with things and allowed readers I know to connect with things and amplify that original sense. And that's kind of what this whole thing is about, is being able to create that empathy. So I'd love to jump to questions. Thank you guys very, very much for bearing with this long presentation. And I hope this was helpful.
This terrific presentation at exactly the length that it needed to be. JD, thank you so much. Catch your breath and let us virtually applaud you. I'll do Sign language. We'll do this. We'll give you snaps. You should open the chat window now, JD, if you don't mind, because many people are
I'm
of the presentation you just gave. Patricia Anderson, I want a T-shirt that says "Empathy is the most subversive thing."
After I make my Charles Schultz is my Elvis T-shirt, I will make one.
Yeah, it's hope punk. That's my fun phrase. And Matthew No asks, how many T-shirt ideas have come out of this conference? And Kathy wants a T-shirt cannon. Okay, so I'm going to turn over to the Q&A, and if you don't mind, JD.
I'm clicking over there right now.
See them. I'd like to read them to you. Certainly for anyone that is following by phone or just by audio, and also for our official record. I know that Matthew asked about a specific panel in your comic, asking whether the top of the narrator's head cut into another panel purposefully. Let's, yes, I think he's talking about the window frame. I think he's talking about the reflection in the window frame and how the narrator's head is not completely in one frame. We had Brian Fees talk the other night about how he purposely divided his mom, his character mom, to create a sense of division. Is that operating here overtly, or is that just for us to read into it?
Well, I'm fascinated by the question because I always thought of the reflection that we're seeing being the person looking out the window as it's raining and not the narrator, but it could definitely be either. That's really cool. That's one of the things I love about comics is you tell everything, but also it exists outside of what you're telling. So as far as the chopping up the head and stuff like that is, I really wanted to make sure people got a sense of that they're looking at a reflection, and the best way to do that is to put a solid object between you and the image. So symbolically, I don't know, but just on a technical level, it was the easiest way to be able to communicate where the solidity of the image is. If you layer one image on top of another without that solidity, it might not read as a reflection. It might read as some kind of artistic layering or ghost. You need my comics tend to stay very grounded in the real world. And so this was an opportunity to try to give that level of grounding so that the rest of the image doesn't become too symbolic.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for fielding that. Kathy Leamy, the inimitable Kathy Leamy asked, was this comic digitally colored or colored with physical art tools?
It was completely digitally colored. I just I colored it all in Photoshop. I used flat colors for the whole thing. I really like handmade comics, and I really like my comics to feel and look handmade. And with this one in particular, it's kind of a sorcerer's trick to look like that because it was actually very digitally constructed, even though I hand drew all of the pictures. And the way I did that was to do flat digital coloring and then to do a gray wash layer underneath that to give everything the illusion of being hand colored. At the timeline I had between when I started working on this comic and when it was going to go to print in Vermont, I just did not have the time to get the hand coloring right. Digital was just so much faster.
Okay, fair enough. I think it's a successful illusion, for lack of a better word. I think it's a successful effect.
Thank you very much.
I was left with the same question. This question comes from me. Do you have an opinion as a former evangelical on Craig Thompson's blankets? And through a graphic medicine lens, how do you feel about the exploration of sexuality through comics?
Craig Thompson's blankets, I really understand a lot of the criticisms that people have about Craig Thompson's work, but I will say unequivocally that blankets is a major influence on me, and I didn't really realize how much until I reread Blankets for the first time since I became a cartoonist about a year ago. And so much of his story resonated with my experience. My issues with my parents were very different than his issues with his parents, but I feel like he nailed the experience of growing up in the evangelical church. And I really, really, I think he gave a lot of the vocabulary. This is very embarrassing to admit, but I stayed in the evangelical church way longer than I should have. And a real pivotal moment for me in my life was I was on staff at an evangelical Christian church when I went through Hodgkin's lymphoma at the age of 27. And when I finished my cancer treatment, I realized that life was just too short to put up with a lot of the bullshit I had to put up with to stay in that context. And I've always felt that a lot of the stuff that is about the Jesus narrative or things like that really has value. And growing up in Silicon Valley, the church was a way out of the materialism that I experienced, but I didn't have a vocabulary to put to being able to leave the church until I read something like Blankets, having been through a pivotal experience where I was now looking for a way out. So, like, Blankets was a huge influence.
Fantastic. And could I just to the question, namely the potential for
touch on the sexuality thing real quick. Comics can and should be about everything. Graphic medicine should be able to go anywhere. And cartoonists who are drawn to talking about those subjects should be given that opportunity. And we need to understand, as with any really loaded issue or experience, what people have to say about that, especially if they're making personal work, isn't always going to resonate or line up with everybody's values all the time. So I think it's really important to give creatives the opportunity to tell the stories that they want to about sexuality, and hopefully with a large enough pool of voices, more people's experiences can be reflected, and we don't have to hold any specific artist up as someone who addresses this.
Fantastic. Thank you. Some more questions have come in. This one is from Dana Walrath, who I owe an apology for missing her question in a previous panel. She did post one to the Q&A, and I ran out of time to get to it. So I'm delighted that I could read this one now. Dana Walrath says, JD, you said empathy is subversive, and I love that. What do you think is the root of the collective fear to connect across divisions now? Highly philosophical. So this comes from both an artistic place, a theological place, a personal place, but
I'm so happy to get this question. It's part of it's kind of funny, like asking a cartoonist this, but at the same time, I'm thrilled to get this question.
Why not?
I think it's important to. Okay, so we have a lot of very bad things going on right now.
Okay.
And the way we have to communicate about those things in the most immediate way and in the way that gets response from others are shaped by algorithms that are designed to echo engagement. And because of this, our most extreme frustrations and fears, and in a lot of ways, our sense of powerlessness gets amplified the most in the way that we're communicating to each other. And that can be very overwhelming, and it can be very easy to view us individually as not having enough power or sway in what's going on to be able to really do anything except for bang our hands on the ground and scream to heaven. But honestly, looking at the people who made the silence equals death thing, they were a collective who grew together because they felt so powerless. And they met together for a year to come up with a poster that has two icons and two words on it, and it changed the debate and strengthened people. So there's a lot of things that try to keep us isolated and engaged with technology and less engaged with the people around us. As artists, we have the opportunity, and I'd say the same thing actually about clinicians. We have the opportunity to look around us and try to engage with the world that we actually see, as opposed to the commentary that is desperately trying to frame what we see in a marketable way.
Matthew wants to know it's been done before. What's your favorite Thelonious Monk record?
Okay, I hate to do this, but I have to give you two, and it's for a very specific reason. My all-time favorite album of his is a live album called Mysterioso that he cut with Johnny Griffin in 1958. It's a really killer live album. It has probably his best music on it, but it's awful on headphones because Oren Keepnews, his producer, didn't know that you weren't supposed to keep talking while the set was going on. Huh. So if you're just listening to it on like a stereo or in the background or in a car or something, it just sounds wonderful front to back. But if you have headphones on, you can just hear Oren Keepnews chatting away the whole album, and it's really distracting. So if you're a headphone listener, not Mysterioso, but if you're listening to it in any other context, it's definitely the best. If you're listening on headphones, then I'd go with Brilliant Corners. It's from a very similar era. Great Sonny Rollins is on that one, and it just has probably pound for pound his best compositional work.
Well, we want to support all the art here, even though we're focused on comics. So thank you for doing that. Just a point of order, our graphic note taker, Sandra Bartholomew, who's been posting some beautiful stuff on Twitter and making it available through her Patreon. Sandra wants to know if she can put the actual comic in her sketch notes.
Oh my God, please.
Okay.
Please do.
We didn't want to.
Hey, Sandy, she was the year below me at CCS, so she's the darn coolest, and I've been so impressed with your work this whole time. I'm so honored that you were my sketch note artist for this.
That is so nice. Oh, and more love coming from CCS with a number of other alumni who have presented here this weekend. So good, we got the all clear on that. Question from KC Counselor. JD, you mentioned that you heard this song years before you made this comic.
Yeah.
From the point of deciding to create it to completing it, how much time passed? And Casey says that overall they're interested just to know more about your process.
That's a great question too. So I first heard the song. I didn't hear the recording of it. My dear friend Gren would come to the Writers and Artists Retreat, and he would bring his little travel guitar or ukulele, and he'd go wandering in the woods. And then at night, he'd come back with a new song every night. And I guess he must have written this one around, I'm going to guess 2012, and I made the comic in 2015. But I made the comic in 2017. So I first heard him sing the song just on ukulele, sitting around at night. Everybody had a glass of wine probably, and it's probably about 15 of us or so, and he sang it. And the realness of this, like, it felt like the most personal work I'd heard of somebody who I'd heard share a lot of personal work at this retreat. And he'd written a lot of autobiographical stuff. And this song wasn't really 100% autobiographical, but I was just floored by it when I first heard it. And I wasn't thinking in terms of comics quite then. It would have probably been about a year later. But as soon as I started thinking about making comics, I was just waiting to use it as one of my CCS assignments. But my process is very slow, like 5 years for a 4-panel comic. I mean, I made other work in between that, but I kicked around the idea for a very long time, but it took a long time to find the right format for it, because for a long time I thought I'd do a zine and try to adapt the whole thing. And then as I learned more about comics and comics making, and as I learned more about the AIDS crisis and stuff, I felt like there had to be a real narrowing of focus to be able to tell that story, and really a real barreling down on what is the core thing that Gren was talking about. And so something that I thought was going to be 8 pages became 4 panels, and that kind of process takes a very long time.
Mm-hmm. So hypothetically, if we had done this whole event in the physical space of MCPHS University, what would you have asked people at the workshop to do?
Okay, if it wouldn't have had this comic in it at all.
Okay. So wow, I'm sort of finding this fortuitous in its own way, that we only are treated to this because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, that's how this came about. I was going to do a workshop that I did at the Brighton Graphic Medicine Conference, where actually it's putting into practice a lot of the ideas that this comic is about. And I made a zine that is essentially the workshop that I wasn't able to put on as a zine, that I don't put online, because I quote some people's published work that I'd rather just have it be a free handout at things. I don't mind talking to you guys about it here. But the basic idea was that when I did the Veterans Project with CCS, when we first tried to get cartoonists and veterans together, there was a real disconnect between the shy veterans who'd been through whatever they've been through and the shy cartoonists who didn't really know how to necessarily connect with people of different life experience. But when we got veterans and cartoonists together a second time, and we put the sketchbooks in the hands of the cartoonists so that the cartoonists could talk with people and draw them, the way that changed the dynamic of the conversation was absolutely incredible. And it had nothing to do with the quality of the art. It had everything to do with the attentive listening that happens when someone is drawing and talking to somebody. And also the way people talk when they know they're being seen. So I wanted to recreate that experience for clinicians and for academics and stuff like that, where they could see the power of sitting down and drawing somebody and talking to them as a way of breaking through an excess of professional distance and helping people connect in a real world way. It was very successful at the Graphic Medicine Conference in Brighton. So I was really looking forward to sharing that with everybody here. But it turned out I got to talk about a lot of the same things by going through this comic.
Well, I hope you'll consider sharing that with us in the future when we get the further opportunity to operate in meat space. I'm going to make this our final question because I think it's a great note to go out on. Alice Jaggers wants to know, where is your puppy? Can we see it?
Oh my gosh, I would love to have Bo Brown come and say hi, but I think he went for a walk and is now asleep. I'm really sorry. What I can recommend is if you go to my social media, I post pictures of the dog, especially now with what we're going through daily, because I know that my Basset Hound gives me life and he's quite a character. So please go to my social media and follow Just for the Dog.
Well, let me say this. So first of all, thank you again so much for this time today, JD. This was a wonderful deep dive through your process, the subject, the history, and the overall art. So it was so very much worth it. Now we have one last concluding panel coming up, and I would invite all children and dogs and cats. Shadow may show up, and other people's doggies. I believe Matthew No has some dogs, a dog or more to feature. Patricia Anderson has a dog to feature. Dogs of Graphic Medicine hashtag on Instagram. So I hope all of you will consider rejoining us in a little over an hour's time for a brief set of concluding remarks, a wrap up, and a few calls to action. I'm going
be there or be square.
Be there or be square. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you again, sir.
Thanks.